Hey everyone, Mr. Happy here and welcome back to another video on Eureka Orthos. Now I am working on a guide for our latest deep dungeon, but I'm realizing now that it's going to be quite the undertaking, so I'm not sure when that'll be done. That being said, there's one aspect of the new deep dungeon that I'm seeing a lot of comments on in both my own YouTube comment section video and social media and forums and whatnot. Now, quite a few comments in my Eureka Orthos Thoughts video were about the Dread Beasts. People were saying they were having issues with them, they were running into them, they were causing wipes, and so I wanted to make a video talking more in depth about the Dread Beasts and how to counter them, whether that be methods of actually defeating them or methods of absolutely avoiding them. So for those who haven't been keeping up with the latest deep dungeon, what are Dread Beasts? Well, these are basically mini bosses that can randomly appear on any floor. When you enter a floor, it will say that there is a Dread Beast on it, and at that point, you have to make a decision about whether you want to actually tackle the monster or completely avoid it. If you do decide to defeat it, it will always drop a treasure coffer, and it will grant everyone a 30-minute buff depending on which of the bosses you defeated. The three bosses you can see are as follows. There's a Lamia, which has a ranged flame circle AoE, a petrification look away, and gradually gains stacks of regen, making them harder and harder to kill. If you defeat the Lamia, you will get a 30-minute regen that ticks for a couple of thousand every few seconds. A nice little thing on top of any healing you may have. The next one is the Mericidian. Now this one's all about big damage, and as such his main skill is Berserk, which is a stacking damage buff. You can actually interrupt this, and I would highly advise it if you plan on actually fighting this thing out. His only other major attack is Hard Thrust, which is a ranged mini tank buster. We'll talk about that in a bit. And I guess there is also his Meteor AoE, which is a massive AoE. This will instantly kill anyone if it is not avoided, or if you use a wall to line of sight it, that will work as well. Defeating the Mericidian will grant you a 30-minute damage buff of about 25%, just eyeballing it. And then finally, you have the Kachma, which I like to call the Kakma. This one really just hits a lot, like over and over again, and gets a gradually stacking damage reduction. When it gets low on health, it will begin casting Genesis, and I'm not gonna lie, I barely fight the Dread Beast as it is, at least in a fair fight, and thus I've never actually seen what the finished cast of Genesis does, nor do I really want to see it in the first place. It is the same name as the room-wide explosion from the Kakmas and the Sephiroth fight, so it's worth assuming that it's probably a giant explosion as well, but I would probably just not worry about that and just kill it before that happens. And of course, upon defeating the Kakma, you will get 30 minutes of damage reduction. Now on the surface, none of these things seem that bad. However, they all hit insanely hard and have a pretty chunky health pool to boot, especially with the Kakma having damage reduction and the Lamia getting health back over time. Not to mention, they all have some sort of double hit mini tank buster, whether that be Flame Circle, Hard Thrust, or whatever the Kakma does, and that hits hard and from far away. I can stand like a room and a half away and it can still hit me. So kiting them can be really scary outside of set circumstances. You'll need constant healing, and you'll need to avoid an actual auto attack at all costs in order to have a safe amount of health. Even steeled tanks will die in almost no time without proper cooldowns and healing, without any help. It's just so painful to fight them. So I've probably scared you, or you're watching this video and have already been absolutely destroyed by a Dread Beast. So really, what are your options with dealing with this super high amount of damage? Well, first I want to warn you against something that doesn't work, at least not in the way you're probably hoping it does. The Dread Palms, which will turn you into a Dreadnought, don't work when it comes to one-shotting them. They're one skill, it's supposed to knock back, and one-shot, that just doesn't work on these things at all. I suppose you could use the 2 skill to give it a vuln up if you're with a party, but honestly that doesn't seem like a great use for this. However, things like landmines and exploding silver chests do deal damage to them, so it's possible to only need to deal with about 30% of their health bar, which is super doable. If you just were to have like a tank invuln and to just zerg it down real quick, that would totally work. The big thing that makes them doable more than anything else is the Lethargy Protomander. It makes their damage manageable for tanks and can even make kiting somewhat manageable as well, but you would probably want something like a clone helping you to deal damage, and you're still going to need a lot of healing for those ranged attacks, even if they are slow. And again, you still need to avoid those random autos if it manages to catch up to you. I've actually tanked one on Warrior and soloed it with the clone to help with DPS under Lethargy, but still, it's not exactly the coziest thing. The most efficient means is to definitely use a Protomander of Storms. This reduces them to 1 HP, meaning you can just tap them once and it's over with. It is still kind of dangerous though. If you use Storms out of combat and it's not a no regen floor, then the boss can instantly server tick and gain 10% of their health back, which can be scary if you're banking on killing them in a single hit and you're not preparing for the extra 10% in any way. It's more ideal to get aggro on them, then use the storm, then kill it. But then you run the risk of just being killed in 2 or 3 hits, and that's a problem all in of itself. Again, unless you have a tank and Vuln and can actually manage to buy that time. So one of the options is to use something like a Witching Pomander. If you do this, then that's going to reduce how dangerous they are most of the time. If you get a frog, they're completely helpless. If you get a chicken, then they'll still auto you pretty hard. Non-tanks would still be at threat of being killed in 2 auto attacks. And if you get the imp, it's basically just removing the double auto, but otherwise it's still doing full attack damage. So that doesn't really help at all. So there's just so many little things that can go wrong with storms if you are solo. But, you know, if you're with a group at the very least, and, you know, it changes things up a little bit, I suppose. It's just, you just got to be extra careful if you're going for these storm strats. But the #1 way of dealing with dread beasts is to not go near them. There is so much risk incurred here that it can often just cost you more than it's worth. Yeah, the 30-minute buff is cool, especially if it's the damage buff, but unless you were already going to use a resource or it just seems like the best choice is to clear the floor anyway, then I wouldn't use it for the sole purpose of killing a dread beast. Now that's not great advice, because I'm willing to bet a few of you have had a dread beast in your exit room, maybe even standing on top of the exit itself. So how do you deal with this? Well, there is knowledge for you to be had, and it is about aggro types in Final Fantasy XIV. In case you didn't know, different monsters in Final Fantasy XIV aggro you depending on different types of actions, even in the open world, which is something you don't really interact with very often. Some monsters aggro by sight, meaning they will only attack you if you step within like a frontal cone of vision. Sound type mobs will aggro to anyone who's actually running around them, but walking, using the actual like walk command in game, will actually avoid that altogether. And then proximity aggro will just aggro you no matter what. Walk, run, jump, hide, it doesn't matter. There is actually also something called touch aggro. Sometimes if you just walk directly through a monster's hitbox, it disregards its aggro type and just pounces on you. This really only happens with sound aggro, I feel, but it's something to consider. There are more aggro types in places like Stormblood's Eureka, not this one, but in this Eureka, just those 4 types exist. Fortunately, all 3 dread beasts only aggro by sight, which means walking behind them is a perfectly safe way to bypass them. Now, bear in mind that monsters in Eureka Orthos turn occasionally, and it's one of the most important things that you can master in there is understanding how frequently something turns and when the last time it turned was before making a move. So at the end of the day, if you need to navigate around any of these dread beasts, the best thing to do is to be patient. Even if it's somewhat inside of the exit, you can sometimes squeeze right next to them and just not be in front of them. But this is something that takes practice, it takes skill, it just takes an understanding. And I bet a lot of people playing an Endwalker, who started playing an Endwalker, have not yet had to interact with different aggro types before, and as such, this is information that will hopefully be of use to you. Now, I'm sure there is the unfortunate possibility that you could end up in a situation where you're trying to clear for a floor, you're trying to open the exit, and you have 1 enemy left, and it's a dread beast. I'm willing to bet that can happen, especially on some of the lower floors, but I'm sure on any floor, really. If that happens, you do have a choice of waiting for a respawn. On the lower floors, the respawns take, well, no time at all. It can be as early as 30 seconds. On the later floors, though, it's minimum 10-minute wait. So I highly advise just keeping storms handy in case you have to deal with a dread beast and not just using them because they're cool to use. Unless you're doing 21 to 30, in which case you'll be absolutely fine. You don't need to hold Protomanders for anything in there. You can just go buck wild. Anyway, that's going to be a wrap for my video on the dread beasts in Eureka Orthos and Final Fantasy XIV. Be sure to like, favorite, subscribe, and share, and I will try to get, maybe in 2 parts, the Eureka Orthos guide. I really need to accurately discuss all of the random enemies because of how dangerous every single one of them is in terms of, you know, knowing what their AoEs do and everything, so you don't just randomly die to an AoE you didn't know existed. So that's the part that's going to take a while, and that may warrant a 2, maybe even 3 video series when it comes to this. So we'll see. Anyway, thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one, and until then, take care.